Today, the house price past the parcel blame game. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, whichever way you look at it, house prices in Australia are way, way above where they used to be. We know that in terms of debt to income, in terms of price to GDP, and indeed any other metric, we are absolutely in the stratosphere, and we have some of the worst metrics in the world. So what's very interesting to me is how everybody in positions of responsibility around the place are all blaming each other or claiming it's nothing to do with them. Recently, the Reserve Bank said house prices are nothing to do with them and it's really just an outcome. And APRA also said quite recently they didn't look at house prices, it wasn't something on their radar. And now we have the federal government who basically are also trying to pass the parcel and blame the states and territories for what's going on. It's very interesting. Everybody is doing this. It's not my problem, it's somebody else's. That, I think, signals two things. Firstly, that people know this is a real issue. And secondly, they don't want to be held accountable. It's worth remembering, of course, that in New Zealand, the government there has now imposed on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand a specific obligation to consider the impact on house prices there of their monetary policy decisions. I think we need the same here to start with, but there's a lot more to be said as well. But let me go back to what the federal government just said. This was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald today. The federal government says the states and territories must take responsibility for Australia's housing affordability crisis, saying it's local levies imposed on new developments that are hurting first home buyers. In a salvo that caused the New South Wales government to fire back, Federal Housing Minister Michael Sukkar said the states need their feet held to the fire to address rising house prices, and it was not up to the Commonwealth to fix the problem. He warned that every additional burden placed onto developers by the states is passed on to consumers and exacerbates the affordability challenge. The rebuke of the states prompted New South Wales Planning Minister Rob Stokes to blame interest rates and federal tax rules for pushing up prices, opening a new front in the debate over how to make housing more affordable for young Australians. Sydney and Melbourne property prices have been rising at their fastest rate in decades, raising concerns amongst economists and MPs about housing affordability. Sydney's median house price reached $1.3 million in March, after the fastest increase on Domain records, while Melbourne's median price increased to $974,000. Residential developers in outer suburban and regional growth areas must pay levies for infrastructure, such as roads, parks and local services, to the state government, as well as developer contributions collected by councils, but are overseen by state planning policies. In new housing developments in Western Sydney, contributions can amount to more than $80,000. What we need to do is to draw the nexus a bit closer to, I think, hold state and territory governments' feet to the fire a little more, Mr. Sukkar said at an Urban Development Institute of Australia conference in response to a question about whether the federal government had any levers available to collaborate with the states and territories to reduce the impost on first home buyers. Mr. Sukkar told the conference on Thursday he would never say the Commonwealth could ride in on its white horse and fix it or convince state governments of the merits of reform or fund the reform, and that GST was the main federal contribution. The much bigger issue we have here is the affordability challenge in our major cities, which is a real and present risk for all state governments, he said. Properties in Sydney have recorded their biggest surge in 17 years, but it's raised fears that more buyers will borrow more money. And the federal minister's comments prompted Mr. Stokes to raise the Commonwealth taxes applied to players in the burgeoning built-to-rent sector as a thorn in the side of its viability. Built-to-rent refers to residential developments leased out by developers typically for the benefit of long-term renters and are presented as an alternative to home ownership. Let's tear down the myth that supply is the determinant of housing affordability. Planning plays an important and significant role in getting new houses to market. But let's not pretend tax rules and interest rates don't also push up prices, Mr. Stokes said. The emerging build-to-rent sector is a prime example. While our recently announced policy to introduce build-to-rent development in our market has been welcomed, industry tells us that the Commonwealth tax treatment makes projects unfeasible. Mr. Stokes said he'd written to Mr. Sukkar on the issue and he failed to respond. He said New South Wales was fast-tracking projects through planning reforms and adopting recommendations from the Productivity Commission to enable more certainty and transparency surrounding infrastructure contributions. Mr. Sukkar used the federal government's decision to waive Tasmania's historic $158 million housing debt in late 2019 as an example of intervention, saying it was on the basis the state undertake planning reform. Last year, Reserve Bank of Australia research found planning and zoning restrictions added hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of a home in some states. So we will use these opportunities where we can, but I would certainly not want to create the impression that we're able to step in and usurp those responsibilities for the states. We just don't have the power to, and it lets them off the hook a bit too. So we just need to focus where the decision-making lies, he said. After promoting the success of the Home Builder Grant Scheme, which provided up to $25,000 for new home builders and mainly benefited detached dwellings, Mr. Sukkar said the federal government would have to respond to the apartment market. It is such an integral part of the housing strategy now, while keeping a very close eye on it, as it's very exposed to factors of international students and migration, he said. UNIDA New South Wales CEO Steve Mann said there was an opportunity for the New South Wales government to work with local councils to unlock funding from underused developer contributions to fund the gap and get a double dividend from critical infrastructure projects, which then unlocks housing and jobs. The federal government needs to get better at putting conditions on the infrastructure investment it puts into states so that urban planning, transport and other infrastructure is delivered in a timely and integrated way, delivering the world-class housing we need for our cities to thrive, he said. And Property Council of Australia New South Wales Executive Director Jane Fitzgerald said that with housing affordability firmly back in the spotlight, there needed to be faster, more streamlined approvals for homes Sydney desperately needs. With low interest rates and strong recovery, it's more important than ever that we've got a planning system that ensures supply can meet demand, she said. Rising house prices in major cities such as Sydney and Melbourne have prompted coalition MPs to propose using superannuation funds to help first home buyers save up for a deposit. Liberal MP Tim Wilson launched a campaign last year pushing for an inquiry into housing affordability and the ability for first-timers to be able to pull money out of their mandatory super fund for a property. When asked about the appetite for such a scheme, the federal government had previously referred to an existing program allowing first home buyers to make extra savings within their superannuation, which can later be withdrawn for a deposit. Independent MP Craig Kelly, who left the Liberal Party in February, said he might now be prepared to take up the mantle. I might introduce a private member's bill, Mr Kelly said, adding he was disappointed the Liberal Party had not progressed with the idea. One thing lost in this super debate is the money has to come from somewhere. Every dollar of super has to be earned by the employer or the employee. It takes a dollar out of current expenditure and away from young people struggling to get into the housing market, he said. If you retire and don't own your own home, you'll struggle financially. You can have the super money when you're 65, 66 or 67, but you can't get it when you need it, he said. It seems to be back to front. Housing is very important, and home ownership is a building block of society. So here you go, the same old arguments of undersupply being the problem, when in fact we've already got 1.2 million spare properties across Australia and more being built, particularly high-rise being built. There's massive pressure on both state and federal government from major developers to seek financial support to help them with their construction cycles, simply because they're not getting huge demand for those properties at the moment, and many have massive capital investments underway. And so we come back to this wonderfully complex and yet such simple question. What is the underlying driver that is creating the house price growth? It's simply this. It's credit availability. With interest rates so low and lending standards very much slackened off, thanks to APRA as well as bank policies, people can just get bigger loans. When they can get bigger loans, and if they also couple, by the way, if they're a first-time buyer, money from the bank of mum and dad, as I reported today on ABC News 24, I'll put a link above for that, then it's not surprising that house prices continue to go ever higher. And remember that whilst interest rates are very low, migration is almost at zero and international buyers are off the radar. So you can't blame them for that. And if you can't blame undersupply of property, you cannot blame migration or other international factors for driving prices higher. You can't blame an undersupply of property because there is plenty of property around and we're building a lot more than we need at the moment. And of course, the overall population growth is continuing to slow at the moment rather than actually accelerate away because of the borders being shut. Which takes us back to credit availability. And the missing piece of the puzzle, and the piece that nobody wants to take responsibility for, is the fact that credit availability is too loose, people are too leveraged, and if you look carefully, more and more households are getting into more and more difficulty. In fact, I'll be reporting tomorrow my latest stress survey results, which will be for the month of April, and there I'll be able to point out just what's happening with more people getting into cash flow difficulty. But my question today is, why is it that everybody's blaming everybody else and nobody's stepping up to take accountability for house prices? Or to put the question another way, who at a state or a federal level or at a regulatory level is actually stepping up and taking accountability for the trajectory of home prices? The answer is nobody is, because everybody wants to avoid the issue. My belief is we need to make the Reserve Bank directly accountable and responsible for house prices, just as they've done in New Zealand, and that they should consider monetary policy in the light of the impact on home prices. I think we might find the trajectory will be rather different. But of course, we then also have to deal with the massive problems of a decade or two of accelerating home prices relative to income. Don't expect incomes to correct anytime soon. So housing affordability is going to be a noose around our necks for at least the next generation or two. No wonder politicians want to blame each other and look away, bearing in mind that this is way beyond the current election cycle. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.